There's a political crisis brewing in Hungary, and it's one that could redefine the European Union as we know it. At the center of this storm is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, a leader whose vision for Hungary is colliding head-on with EU principles. As Orbán pushes Hungary down a path that many argue is increasingly authoritarian, the EU finds itself in a standoff, struggling to balance its commitment to democracy and rule of law with the sovereignty of its member states. So, what's really behind this clash, and how did we get here? To understand this crisis, we need to start with Viktor Orbán himself. Since coming to power in 2010, Orbán has transformed Hungary's political landscape. His administration has centralized power, limited press freedom, and passed sweeping judicial reforms that critics argue undermine judicial independence. Orbán justifies these moves as essential for strengthening Hungary, arguing that centralized control helps protect the country's values and sovereignty in a rapidly changing world. In his view, Hungary has a right to chart its own course, free from external pressures, even if that means going against EU norms. But here's the catch: the European Union is founded on shared principles, with democracy and rule of law at the core. For the EU, these aren't just ideals, they're binding commitments. When countries join the EU, they agree to uphold these values. And as Hungary continues down a path that appears to weaken democratic institutions, the EU has responded by invoking mechanisms to hold Hungary accountable. Brussels has threatened financial sanctions, withholding funds designated for Hungary, and has openly criticized Orbán's government for backsliding on democracy. So, what's at stake here? For Orbán, this is a question of sovereignty. He argues that the EU is overstepping, using financial penalties as a way to enforce its own ideology on Hungary. Orbán's supporters see his defiance as a stand for Hungarian independence, pushing back against what they view as EU interference. And he's made no secret of his ambition to reshape Hungary in line with his vision, a vision he describes as illiberal democracy, one that prioritizes national identity, cultural preservation, and strong leadership over the more liberal, pluralistic values often promoted by the EU. Yet for the EU, allowing Hungary to move in this direction poses a serious threat. If one country starts disregarding core EU values, it could set a dangerous precedent for others. In other words, if Hungary can act independently on issues like judiciary independence and press freedom, what's to stop other countries from doing the same? The EU has no intention of allowing member states to drift away from shared principles, as it would undermine the Union's very foundation. That's why Brussels has taken an unusually firm stance with Hungary, wielding the financial tools at its disposal to try to bring Orbán in line. But this isn't just a clash between one leader and the EU. It's a test of the EU's ability to enforce its values within a union that prides itself on unity and diversity. If the EU pushes too hard, it risks fueling Euroscepticism in Hungary and beyond, as populist movements across Europe seize on Orbán's defiance as a model for resisting EU authority. On the other hand, if the EU is too lenient, it risks weakening its credibility and potentially emboldening other leaders to follow Hungary's example. For ordinary Hungarians, the consequences of this standoff are already being felt. The European Union has withheld billions in funding, arguing that these funds should not go to a government that disregards EU principles. This impacts infrastructure, social programs, and other services that rely on EU support. For some Hungarians, this has sparked resentment toward the EU, seeing it as punishing the Hungarian people for the actions of their government. For others, it's a wake-up call, a reminder that Hungary's ties to the EU come with both benefits and responsibilities. Orbán has shown no signs of backing down. Instead, he's doubled down, framing this conflict as a defense of Hungary's right to self-determination. He has openly questioned the EU's moral authority, calling the EU bureaucrats out of touch with the everyday realities of its member states. And as Orbán appeals to nationalism, he's found allies among Europe's populist leaders, who share his skepticism of EU centralization and champion a return to stronger national control. But where does this leave the European Union? If it can't enforce its principles, the EU risks becoming little more than an economic bloc, with political unity crumbling under the weight of national interests. The Union's leaders know this, which is why they're standing firm, hoping to prove that Europe's values are non-negotiable. They're banking on the idea that Orbán, despite his rhetoric, can't afford to alienate the EU indefinitely. After all, Hungary relies heavily on EU funds, and Orbán's policies could eventually put Hungary's membership in jeopardy if the standoff continues. As this crisis escalates, the future of Hungary's relationship with the EU remains uncertain. Is Orbán testing the limits of European unity, or is this the beginning of a new era of more independent national policies within the EU? And, more importantly, can the EU strike a balance between respecting member states' sovereignty and enforcing the collective principles that bind them together? These questions don't have easy answers. But one thing is clear: this isn't just about Hungary or the EU. It's about the future of Europe and what kind of union it aspires to be. Will it be a union where values come first, or a collection of countries held together by economic convenience? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay informed as this story continues to develop.